Well, we're going to get started back in on final assembly on the 60 MGA. We're over here at the owner's house in his shop. Lighting sucks, so bear with me on that. I'm starting to try to assemble the doors here. So getting the hinges bolted on, and I went ahead and loosely put the latch in this door. And we got the heads of all the screws painted. And while I was waiting on those to dry, I went ahead and did all the splash shields, the seals on the splash shields here now. So now I'm looking at how I'm going to actually do the final assembly, because if you remember, I stuck these things on here to make sure that they were safe to transport everything over here and that nothing would happen to any of this stuff. So it's much easier to put the welting in here without the fender on. And I think it's a little easier to start with getting the rear fender where you think it's supposed to be, get it kind of in place, then bolt the door on kind of lined up to the rocker and rear fender, and then the front fender, because since I took the hinges completely off the doors, it's possible that I might have to, let me show you here, adjust the hinges here, right here. If I have to do any adjustments with those hinges, then the fenders can't be on for me to adjust those. And somehow I forgot to put in a drill mark. Usually I would drill through for an alignment mark, and I forgot to do that when I took this apart, which is going to make it a little harder for me to line everything up. So I'm probably going to end up just blowing this thing back apart, taking the fenders off, and starting from there. This is a couple of other cars he has. Years ago, I put some floor panels in this car and patched the quarter panel right here, and then painted the lower quarter and blended it all in. And I actually fixed the trunk here too one time. Didn't get nearly as good a paint match there. My paint supplier had closed up, and I went to a different paint supplier, and they just couldn't get anywhere close. And I blended and with every bit of paint I had laying around, trying to get it as close as possible, and only got close enough to be acceptable, but not nearly as close as I'd like to be. And that's a 69. And then he's got this. It's a 50. Oh, I'm trying to think. 56, I think it is, or 57 Julietta Sprint that he pulled out of a barn. And years ago now, it's been 4 or 5 years probably, I did lower panels, fixed the jacking points all the way around, redid the rockers, lower fenders, did lower quarters on it, did a bunch of patching up in around the fender wells, front half fender wells, back half fender wells, patched the floors, and some patching up and around the inner fenders there, and a little bit around the front here too. And then he was going to finish cleaning all the under seal and get it blasted, and then good primer, and then we were going to continue with it from there. And it kind of got stalled out and has been sitting on his lift here without a whole lot getting done to it. Now this is the way I like to do these. You get this, the end of this lined up right to the edge of the opening there. And then you tape it on the line, use this blue painter's tape. Then you can come in here, and right where every one of these holes are, there's one of the fender bolt holes, and you can mark where every one of them is at, so you can cut around them. And if you have the old welting still sitting around, you can look at how they cut those out and cut them out the same way, but I wouldn't recommend just duplicating the old welding with the new welding, and by putting them side by side and marking them like you'd think would be a good idea, because the welting has a tendency to shrink, especially once you've taken it off and it's been sitting for a while stored on a shelf, because then your new welting will end up short on the ends, and you don't want that. So then once you get there, you come around here, and then you can come down here and cut it off. Now I tend to like to maybe cut this off just a hair long until you're final assembled, and then you can trim that exactly. But this stuff is kind of soft. I think it's actually a little softer than the original stuff, and it can be very difficult to get the stuff to look nice and smooth and pretty once you've bolted the fender on. And it's very important while you're doing the body work on these things to make sure these flanges and stuff are nice and straight. They're not big, all wavy and stuff, because a lot of people will forget to straighten the flange on the fender. And then it makes it that much harder to get this stuff to line up, because it'll be really tight here and then be loose and flopping around, or be really tight right at the bolt and then be loose and flopping around in between the bolts. So you got to make sure you hammer and dolly the edge of the fender straight and flat, and get rid of all the bumps and lumps from where it was bolted on in the past and maybe potentially over tightened. And of course, nowadays the way they're packaging this stuff up, they're packaging it up really tight, so it ends up leaving all these little bends in them that make it that much harder, where they used to package them up a little bit looser and more of a roll, where it didn't do that. So when I was lining up all the body panels in this thing, I made sure that I had this edge of the fender even with this, so that way as I put the fender on, I know where it's supposed to be. Then I can line the door up to it. And I also made sure that this was right even with this here, and then adjusted door gaps to get my best happy medium between the two. That way it'd be a lot easier to line up later, because A's are not known to be easy to line up all the body panels on. So on this welting here, you just have to really go through and start from one end of the fender and just work your way back and try to get it to sit nice and pretty along the edge of the fender, but then tighten the bolts. And it's a bit of a balance there on how tight to go with them. If you go a little too tight, it'll make this pucker and stick up. But you want to make sure you have it tight enough that the fender doesn't want to loosen off while driving. So it's a bit of a tightrope walk there, getting it to look nice and feeling like you actually have it tight enough. But you just work your way along every bolt and work down the fender until you get to the back. And one other little tip is these are the bolts that hold the fenders on, and they have these big long elongated washers on them. Now as you're tightening the bolts, these will want to spin on you. Now you need to make sure as you're tightening them that they don't spin on you, because you can tighten them, they can turn up into the fender and actually put dents coming up off the bottom of the fender if you don't watch that. I have seen cars come into my shop with just dink, 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 dink along the fender here, where when they tighten them, it turned up and put dents in them. So you want to make sure you don't do that. All right, so we got the welding on there. It's not what I would call 100-point show quality, but I think it looks pretty good. So it looks pretty smooth all the way back, and I'm right at that edge. If I tighten these bolts up even a quarter turn more, it will not stay that smooth. It'll start getting waves in it. But considering how many kinks were in this from the way they had it packaged, I think that looks pretty good.